And that garden was probably something that wealthy citizens of Jerusalem owned. They didn't have free land outside of Jerusalem in those days. All of the gardens that were around Jerusalem were owned by very wealthy citizens in Jerusalem. They didn't have big gardens in Jerusalem for two reasons. One, there wasn't enough room inside those walls. And number two, the law forbid them from putting manure or fertilizer on the ground in Jerusalem. So even if you did have a garden in Jerusalem, you couldn't grow anything. And so all of the wealthy citizens would buy these plots or these gardens outside of town, and they would go there to relax. And we don't know who owned this, but obviously they were friends of Jesus, because it says that he and his disciples would go frequently to this place. And so they ministered to Jesus, especially on this night, the night of his greatest need. So it says there in the last part of verse 2, for Jesus oftentimes resorted thither with his disciples. So as they crossed over this Kidron Valley, the people in Jerusalem would have known that during the time of Passover, something significant would have happened if Jesus had crossed over the bottom of this valley to the top of the other side. At Passover time, the lambs, remember, were slaughtered in the temple. And about 10 years after this, they did a count of them, and they said approximately 256,000 lambs were slaughtered in Jerusalem during the Passover season. That's a lot of lambs. That's a lot of blood. And the blood from all of that would run out of a funnel kind of thing into this ravine of the Kidron Valley, and would run down and mix with the water that was a little stream that was running down through this valley. And so here is Jesus, the Lamb of God, who's going to be slain for the sins of the world. He walks over this little ravine into the Garden of Gethsemane. And he and his disciples would have to step over and to smell of this water mixed with lamb's blood. Now what a picture of what he's going to do, and what a picture of his love for us. So he walks over to the other side, and then he begins to meet with a series of people, a series of trials before different people. Some of them are official people, and some of them are unofficial. But each of these meetings involve people thinking about and deciding exactly what Tyler was singing about, who Jesus Christ really is. So the first group that we have a meeting with are a few soldiers. It tells us in verse 3 that Judas came to the grove, and he guided a detachment of soldiers and officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And they were carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. Now get this picture in your mind. It's a Passover time, which means there's a full moon. When you have a full moon, you can see fairly well because of the moon. Jesus is there with his disciples. Judas leads this band of people over the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. We don't know exactly what the size was because of the words that's used for detachment. It can mean several things. It could be a group of 600 or a group of 2,000 with cavalry and all of that. Or it could mean just a group of 200. But at least, very least, I think it was at least 60 to 100 people were in this Roman battalion that came to arrest, how many? One lone teacher who is guarded by 11 terrified fishermen, most of them who had between them, we read in the book of Luke, 2 swords. That's all. That's all they had to defend themselves. You know, they bring this huge group of people out. They've got temple guards there and officials and Romans. They have a commander of the Roman battalion there for sure, and they're there to arrest Jesus. They don't know what they're going to face. So they brought torches. They brought lanterns and swords. They brought torches and lanterns. Why? It's a full moon, and they could see everybody because they thought Jesus might hide somewhere. But he didn't hide. We're going to find out. They brought torches to find the light of the world, but they didn't need them. They brought swords to arrest the Prince of Peace. In the end, this huge band of people end up looking pretty silly. You know, the most foolish of all, of course, was Judas. And it's interesting, you read in John's Gospel, it doesn't give Judas much press here in John's Gospel. He's sort of back in the shadows. It just says Judas is there, and he led them, and he stood beside them. He doesn't even talk about the kiss that Judas gave to Jesus to identify him. But the first thing I want you to notice there on your outline is this: Jesus as he goes before the Roman army. And it shows us who he really is. This huge army comes to arrest Jesus, and three things happen. First, Jesus overpowers them. This huge army. The first thing that happens, verse 4 says, Jesus, knowing what was going to happen to him, he went out. Wait a minute, that's a surprise. They're coming to arrest him. Most people, when someone's coming to arrest them, what do they usually do? They run away from them. They don't usually run toward the arresting officer. That usually doesn't happen, but they are coming to arrest Jesus, and Jesus walks toward them. And why did he do that? Because he was confident of God's will. He knew what the will of God was. And so he went out and he asked them, who is it that you want? Who do you want? Look in verse 5. Then Jesus replied, and he said unto them, I am he. Well, they didn't know what he looked like. Judas hadn't identified him yet. It was a moonlit night. And Jesus said, who do you want? Who do you seek? And they said, we seek Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. Let's go on to verse 6 if we might. They all drew back, it says there in verse 6, and they fell to the ground as soon as he said that. Isn't that incredible? Here's this huge army that's come to arrest one man, and he just stands before them, and they all fall to the ground. Are they terrified he's going to attack them? No, they're Roman soldiers. Are they getting into a defensive position? Probably not. It's one man. When Jesus said, I am he used those words that we've come back to again and again and again through the book of John. He said, I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am means I'm God. And Jesus said, just by the power of his name, he terrified them. The recognition of who he was. I am he. And the whole army falls to the ground. Well, then going on in verse 7, it says they picked themselves up, and Jesus said, now who is it you're looking for? And he says again, I'm he. And then next he commands them. He tells them what to do. In verse 8, he says there in verse 8, he's talking about there, Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Is therefore you seek me? Let these go their way. So basically, he says, I'm the one you want to arrest. You came to arrest me. But these other ones, the disciples, I want you to let them go. And then in verse 9, this happened, he said, that the word spoken might be fulfilled. He said, this saying might be fulfilled which he spake, of them which thou gavest me I have lost none. And so he says, I've not lost one of those that you gave me. Now, wow, it's a little strange. They come to arrest Jesus. Jesus is telling them what to do. And they start following his orders. They don't arrest any of his disciples because he has the power of command. Then finally, most amazingly, Jesus protects them. Simon Peter had a sword. Remember, they brought 2 swords into the garden in the book of Luke. And you would guess that Simon Peter would have had one of those under his tunic, knowing Peter. Well, somebody else had the other one, but he had one of them. Verse 10 says that he drew the sword. He just drew it. He drew the sword. And most people think there that when he drew that sword, that he was aiming for the high priest servant's head. And he ducked and Peter missed, because I can't see Peter aiming for an ear. You think you would? Not Peter. I don't think so. He cut off his ear. This is one of the little touches that tell us that this was an eyewitness account that we have here in the book of John. And it says he cut off his right ear, and his name was Malchus. Now Luke tells us that not only did Jesus command Peter to put the sword away, but he also picked up the ear, and he put it back on the servant's